otherwise, we have Dr. Dorinda Carter Andrews with us this evening from Michigan State University. She's a professor in the education department there, and she's going to be talking on systemic racism in education. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to her, and what I understand is she's going to be pretty relaxed with us, so if you have questions, feel free to ask questions and enjoy the conversation.
Wonderful. So good evening.
Good evening.
I was going to sit, but since he's taping, I will stand. And
you can sit if you want.
You sure?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
What do you all prefer? It feels so formal for me to stand, but I'll sit perhaps after I finish talking, because I want to give you some overview information, and then I really want it to be a conversation. I'll say a little bit more about myself. I've been a faculty member in the Department of Teacher Education for 12 years at Michigan State. I'm a former K-12 public teacher. I taught high school math, and I also taught kindergarten. I have teaching experience in urban schools, suburban, predominantly black, suburban, predominantly white, and also independent schools, which are private, and charter schools. So I have a variety of teaching experiences. And then I just decided to go into higher ed based on some advice from my graduate advisor. I consider myself a race researcher. I'm very much interested in issues of racial justice, which is a specific aspect of social justice work, but I do prioritize racial inequities in education in my own work, not at the expense of other inequities. I know that race intersects with class and gender and religion and other social identities as well. But I do firmly believe that there are gross, we know this based on data, gross racial inequities in the educational system, and that those are exacerbated in urban contexts, but they also exist in suburban and rural contexts. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about or share with you, I'd like for you to think about it in the Flint context, right? It won't necessarily be Flint specific, but when we dialogue together, I think we can think about and talk about how these issues apply to Flint and where do we go from here, right? So I don't assume that everyone in the room knows the landscape of education and what the inequities are. If you saw in the description on the flyer, I'm going to be talking about how institutional, structural, and cultural racism is perpetuated in schools, and using critical race theory as a framework for us to understand that. So as a researcher, we use theoretical frameworks, right? And try to bridge theory with practice to better understand how we can improve practice. And I'm a firm believer as a former K-12 practitioner that teachers don't get enough time to sit with educational research, to no fault of their own. There's just not an allotment for that. And so they are often uninformed about what new research says that could help enhance their working conditions and students' learning conditions. And so I want to bring this framework to you. Who's familiar with critical race theory? Anybody in the room? Okay, so this is good. So I'll bring this framework to you to bear on issues that you understand about education in Flint and in other places that you've been or experienced. By show of hands, who's from Flint? Okay. Who's from Michigan but not Flint? Okay, not from Michigan? You are from Michigan. I am not from Michigan. I'm a Southerner. I'm from Decatur, Georgia, and my Southern upbringing frames the ways in which I talk about race. My parents were products of the Jim Crow South, and they talked about it all the time in the house, right? And so I grew up with a certain framing about race and racism. And I'm distinctive about that because they are not the same. They're interrelated, but they're not the same. And so whenever I'm speaking to groups, I bring that to bear, because if I were a different person from a different region of the country, from a different generation, the ways in which I talk about issues of race and racism would be different, right? I'm a child of the 70s, 80s, early 90s. I was part of voluntary busing in the Atlanta area, so my parents figured if they sent us to school on the white side of town that we'd get a better education. And so any of you familiar with those busing programs, some of them were involuntary in areas like Boston, where kids were forced to go across town to different schools. In the Atlanta area, when I was growing up, it was a voluntary system, and my parents took part in that in order to diversify those white schools, right? Let's take the students of color to the white neighborhoods to diversify those schools. And so that context, I think, is important to understanding how I think about issues of race and racism. I would like to, so in my own work, and then I'll move into this, I have, as a researcher, I study Black student achievement specifically, and how African American students develop racial identities and achievement identities that are healthy for academic success. And so what I mean by that is that they see school success and being Black as one and the same, right? That it's part of who I am, it's part of my identity. I don't have to act some other way in order to be successful. Success is just part of a Black identity. And so I studied that in students, in Black students in suburban schools, in majority student of color schools. I studied that with high-performing Black students, average performers, and underperformers. Because what I find is that just because they are underperforming doesn't mean they have less intellectual ability. What are the conditions within the school context that lead kids to underperform, right? So taking it off of they're the problem and how are systems perpetuating oppression against Black and brown youth. My work has also looked at how young people perceive discrimination in their school environment. So there's a whole research around perceived discrimination. It's mostly with students in college. And because I have a passion for studying K-12 youth, I've spent some time asking middle schoolers and high schoolers about perceived discrimination in the school context and that impact on their relationship with teachers. So I'll talk a little bit about some of that. And just as you go, gather your questions. I'll talk for a little bit and then we'll have a dialogue. I've got my phone here to help keep me on time. So the first thing I want to say is the primary mechanisms of racism in public schools are institutional and interpersonal. We often think about racism in education at the interpersonal level. Somebody did something to me. The teacher doesn't like me for this reason. Families feel like they have been personally biased based on race and or class. But primarily, what we see in our system of education is institutional racism, which acts as a function of structural racism. And so I don't want to assume people know the definitions of these terms. So I'm going to start with definitions. How is structural racism defined? Structural racism in the U.S. is really the normalization and legitimation of an array of dynamics. Historical dynamics, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color and also people living in poverty. And I try to be very careful about my language because language has power. And I think there's a difference in, say, low-income people or poor people versus people living in poverty. So even within education, our language, how we talk about subgroups, has implications. And I would challenge you in your everyday life to just be careful about that, right? People are born into conditions of poverty. Kids are born into conditions of poverty. It doesn't make them poor kids. That has a certain kind of framing. Do you see what I'm saying? African American, Black and Latino students underperform in school because of racial bias, not because they are Black or Latino. And so even when we're framing these things in our heads, we have to think about how we frame them and talk about them and call other people on it when they are not talking in responsible ways. So I just wanted to say that. So structural racism is a system of hierarchy and inequity, and it's primarily characterized by white supremacy. So I don't want to talk about racism if you're not going to talk about white supremacy, because racism is a system created by whites advantaging whites, right? That doesn't mean people of color don't enact racism on each other, but it is learned behavior by living in a system, a white supremacist system. Now, right there, I'm taking a certain position. You may or may not agree with that. And I would say in the field of education, even ed researchers don't all take that position, right? But my assumption is structural racism, based on the scholars I align myself with, believe that it's rooted in white racism within a system of white supremacy, okay? You have to think about racism as a systemic problem. If you get stuck at the interpersonal level, you cannot solve systemic problems. You see what I'm saying? And so too often we're thinking about what somebody said to me, did to me. How do I locate that within education, within a system of inequity? And so if I talk about structural racism from a historical perspective, we got to go back to the days of slavery. We're in a U.S. context. Enslaved Africans were just that, enslaved. There was not an opportunity to be literate. So, but meanwhile, there were others going to school, mainly white aristocrats. Even poor whites could not get an education in this country. We have to think about schooling as it began in the U.S. When enslaved Africans, see how I use enslaved Africans, they weren't born slaves, they were born into slavery. Again, how we frame people is very important. And I don't like to think of my ancestors as having come into the world with that label. That very nature dehumanizes and puts the onus on the individual and not on the system that oppresses, right? So we have to change our thinking around that. When enslaved Africans were free, you had 2 million people in this country who didn't know how to read or write. Thus, we created a system of compulsory schooling in the U.S. out of a need, out of a workforce need. We could not have 2 million uneducated people. How would the country thrive? So if you think about compulsory schooling in the United States, it was started out of a workforce need and to have a literate workforce. Having said that, Black education was quite different from white education, even rural white education, right? And so when people talk about achievement gaps, my response is it was never equitable to begin with. The gaps have been there from the beginning because the system was never designed to educate all the people that we have in the country. Labor force and capitalism drives the way we do education. And capitalism in and of itself is racist. I've been called a socialist plenty of times.
That's okay.
I mean, just whatever, right? But if you think about capitalism as a system, it's inherently a racist system, a classist system, an inequitable gender system. You see where I'm going? There have to be winners and losers. And so in the US, where we have institutional structures, the government, health care, housing, education is just one of the institutions, right, in the capitalist structure. All these institutions are operating in an inherently oppressive structure based on white supremacy, where whites are always to be advantaged in the system.